everybody. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Sander. I'm the CEO and founder of Carble. But before this, I've worked in the coffee industry for at least 15 years. First as a trader, but later on as the commercial director of a trading company here in the Netherlands. And although I totally loved my work, over time, two things became more and more frustrating for me. The first one was our industry's inability to address systemic poverty among our producers. When you grow coffee or cocoa as a cash crop, it's almost impossible to provide a decent standard of living for your family. And secondly, the impact that our industry had on the climate. Sadly, both coffee and cocoa destroy our environment, mainly due to deforestation. And I had reached a point where I realized I have to do something now to unite my love for the product on one hand with the values that I hold dear on the other hand. And that became Carble. At Carble, we help companies in the coffee and cocoa industry measure, model, and mitigate their carbon emissions. And we do that by leveraging remote sensing data, so data from satellites, with the end goal of rewarding small-scale farmers for storing carbon. Now, today, I want to make that a little bit more tangible for you all, and I'll do that by talking about a recent project that we did with one of the largest cocoa trading companies in the world, ECOM, and specifically with their team in Peru. My hope is that as takeaways for you all, you'll have a better understanding of how we can work together to make cocoa fit in the net zero future that we're all trying to build together. But before we dive into that, let's have a very quick recap on where cocoa is produced around the world. Most of you will already know this, but bear with me. So the majority of cocoa is produced in West Africa, especially in Ghana and Ivory Coast. But we also see cocoa production in Asia and in Latin America. More than 90% of cocoa is produced by smallholder farmers. So these are families that cultivate plots of, let's say, less than 5 hectares. And they grow cocoa or coffee as a cash crop, so for their main source of income. But they also grow a number of other subsistence crops or foodstuff that they consume themselves in the household. And traditionally, both commodities are grown in agroforestry. That means that the crops are cultivated in the shade of the natural forest canopy. And this comes with huge benefits in terms of carbon storage and biodiversity. I remember the first time when I encountered agroforestry, this was in Ethiopia at a coffee farm. And I had no idea what I was looking at because I had expected to see neat rows of coffee trees. And instead I was looking at a forest. So I asked the farmer to explain to me what I was looking at. And he told me, like, this is just how we've been growing coffee here for generations already. And he mentioned it's better for quality. And much later, when I started to study the academic research of the subject, I realized it's not just quality, but like I said before, it's also carbon storage and biodiversity. Specifically, if we look at biodiversity, then we see that agroforestry in its extensive form. So, of course, there's a gradient of management activities. But if we look at the farms that have the most shade cover, then we see the same number of species as well as the same types of species that we would see in primary forest. And of course, that's hugely beneficial for all of us. There's also a downside to agroforestry, and that is that the yields are typically lower than in sun-grown commodities. And like I explained earlier on, farmers already face a lot of income pressure. So, of course, there's a massive incentive to reduce the number of shade trees, switch to fully sun-grown cocoa. And that comes with a lot of carbon emissions, since all these shade trees have absorbed carbon over the years. Typically, a tree takes, let's say, 20 years to reach maturity. And every year, it absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And if trees are being cut down and burned, then all that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. Now, the general problem of deforestation is much, much larger than most of us are aware of. If we look at global emissions, deforestation is responsible for 5 gigatons annually. That is 5 times as much as the entire global aviation sector. Actually, I like to say if deforestation were a country, then it would rank 3rd in emissions, only behind China and the USA. And if we look back at these agroforestry systems, that they can actually store the same amount of carbon per hectare as is stored by 1,000 flights from London to New York. So I hope you get some form of an understanding of why I'm personally so excited about this subject and also so concerned about the problem of deforestation. In cocoa specifically, it's very important to understand the difference between old versus new origins. So in countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast, where cocoa has already a long tradition of cultivation, we see that around 90% of the forests have already disappeared. So actually there isn't that much deforestation going on anymore. There's still deforestation, and it's hugely important to protect these last bits of forest. But for most of it, it is already too late. On the other hand, newer countries like Peru don't have such a long tradition of cocoa cultivation. In fact, cocoa only became very popular there near the end of the last millennium, when the government introduced it as an alternative to illicit coca production. So we see that in Peru, deforestation is still ongoing at very high rates. And this also means that if you source coffee from Peru versus, for example, Ghana, that you'll see a much higher carbon footprint. And of course, for the industry, which is now more and more focusing on reducing emissions, that is a massive problem. There's one technicality that I quickly want to point out here, and that is that historic emissions from deforestation also have to be included in our carbon footprint calculations. And for this, we typically use a linear discount approach. That means that emissions that took place 20 years ago are still reflected in this year's carbon footprint calculations, but at a lower percentage. So for example, deforestation from 20 years ago only accounts for was a small amount, and deforestation from last year is accounted for a much bigger amount. What is very special about the cocoa sector is that all the key players have set science-based targets to reduce their carbon emissions. In the coffee sector, these are fewer, but in the cocoa sector, all companies have committed to this. And now that we're approaching 2030 quite rapidly, these goals become more and more important. So what science-based targets typically say is that a company is committed to reducing their emissions with 50% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And where previously this used to be the work of only the sustainability teams, nowadays the entire company is involved in this, including the buyers. So what I heard from one customer, for example, is that they said, we will actually stop buying your cocoa until you provide us with evidence that you can meet our commitments to net zero. So that way these goals are trickling down through the entire supply chain. Now, companies are, of course, already getting prepared for this for quite a few years. So most of them have already started to collect farm polygons. Farm polygons are the outlines of the farms. And for that, we use their GPS coordinates. And these farm polygons can be used to calculate emission factors. So that is the total amount of carbon that is emitted from this farm per ton of cocoa that they produce. When we talk specifically about our customer ECOM Peru here, they faced a few challenges with collecting was calculating the carbon emission factors. And the first one was the inaccessible terrain. Cocoa is produced in hilly landscapes, and of course, these are very difficult to get to. So how they addressed this is that they trained a team of data collectors on motorbikes to actually visit all the individual farms. And they did a spectacular job at this. And the quality of the GPS data that they collected was exceptionally high. They often had, let's say, 70 different pinpoints for each polygon, for each farm. And if you multiply that with a very large number of farms that they're sourcing from, then the total amount of data to process is quite massive. And that produced a challenge for them, since traditional off-the-shelf tools like a Global Forest Watch Pro or a QGIS couldn't process that amount of data for them. So they started looking for external companies to help them process the data. And I was really happy that they found us. And what really resonated with them the most was our approach of linking carbon emissions with farmer livelihoods. Like I said at the beginning, this is always the end goal that we are working towards, rewarding farmers for storing carbon in their agroforestry farms. And because ECOM was also facing a lot of pressure from their customers, they gave us only a 2-week deadline to prepare all the data for them. And we were able to meet the deadline, but I must admit that we lost quite some sleep that week, especially the last one of the second weeks. Part of the reasons for that was that the region where the cocoa was sourced had a lot of cloud cover throughout the year. And traditional optical satellites cannot penetrate clouds. So we had to switch to radar-based satellites because the radar signal can penetrate the clouds. And with that approach, we're able to get high-quality measurements for the company, which included 20 years of historic emissions. This is also one of the great things about satellites. Satellites have been observing the Earth already for many years. And even if we only collect the GPS locations today, we can still look back at what happened 20 years ago at these exact polygons. So if you visit farms yourself, for example, I visited a lot of farms in Ethiopia, often you don't see in the landscape what has happened there before. You don't see evidence of deforestation anymore. But then if you look at historical data, suddenly you see that this used to be a lush forest, and nowadays it's grasslands. So that is one of the reasons why I personally love working with remote sensing data so much. We also showed the company where the opportunities lie to mitigate emissions, either by preventing additional deforestation. Let's say if there are farms that still have a lot of shade cover, but our calculations show that there's a lot of deforestation going on in these regions. Then we can point out to ECOM, it makes sense to incentivize these farmers to protect these remaining pieces of shade cover. And also if there are areas where all the shade cover is already gone, then of course that presents an opportunity to work on carbon removals, planting new trees to absorb new carbon from the atmosphere. And finally, we use all the data to model the impact of carbon payments on farmer incomes. So we looked at the entire population and divided them in different income brackets. For that, we use publicly available living income baseline studies. The living income is the amount of money that a family needs to provide a decent standard of living. And we could show, like, without carbon payments, an X percentage earns a living income and the rest earns less than a living income. And with carbon payments of, say, 25 euro per ton of CO2, the number shifts, or with a different carbon price, we see different outcomes. So that allowed ECOM to decide what they want to do next as a follow-up project. Now, that's of course what we're currently discussing and what we're super excited to hopefully be starting with very soon. Results-based payment for carbon storage, specifically for cocoa in Peru. For this, we've just updated our methodology. So the standard methodology for quantifying carbon emissions in our sector is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has released a draft version of its land sector and removals guidance. We've built our entire methodology around this updated guidance, which will be final later this year. Personally, I'm super excited to be working in this field. I think we will only be able to have coffee and cocoa in a net zero future if we make sure that we can produce it while remaining within our planetary boundaries and while benefiting all the people in the supply chain. And who would want to live in a world without cocoa or coffee, right? I know that I definitely wouldn't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sander, for delivering your presentation here at Confectionery Live. It was a very interesting insight into the cocoa sector. Why did you want to talk about this topic in particular?
What I see is that the cocoa sector is setting very ambitious targets to get through the climate crisis. And there is a large understanding within the sector that we need to act now and especially focus on reducing emissions from deforestation. Where maybe a few years ago, people were still looking at offsetting to compensate for the emissions. Nowadays, everybody has realized that we need to prevent emissions before they even take place. So I really want to share one example of how we can work with companies operating in the cocoa supply chains in making sure that their supply chain is fit for net zero in 2050.
I think that's an excellent point about things have definitely moved very quickly, and there's more this sense of urgency. At the start of your presentation, you mentioned your background is in coffee. What made you want to act on the challenges facing the cocoa sector?
What is really interesting is that the cocoa sector seems to be ahead of the coffee sector when it comes to climate. Like I already briefly mentioned in the presentation, all the large players in the cocoa sector have committed to the Science Based Targets initiative. And in the coffee sector, it is the majority as well, but it is not as advanced. So we see that cocoa is maybe 3 to 5 years ahead of coffee. But we don't work exclusively in the cocoa sector. We obviously also still work on coffee.
I think it's a positive note, perhaps, that the cocoa sector is a little bit ahead, but there's maybe still more work to be done. On the subject of targets, you mentioned that key players in the sector are setting science-based targets. Do you think those targets are realistic and achievable?
Well, the entire thinking behind the science-based targets is that they have to be realistic and achievable. So it's not as simple as just somebody saying they commit to net zero in 2050. It used to be like that. So before companies committed to science-based targets, they committed to general climate neutral or net zero statements. And of course, there was a lot of backlash from that as well. And other companies that I spoke to, especially the smaller companies, they actually said like, wow, our CEO committed to net zero, but we actually don't have any idea how we're going to achieve it yet. But I think, and that's why I'm so optimistic, especially in the cocoa sector, especially for the larger players, these plans are very well thought through. And there's also a requirement to allocate very serious budgets to it. So yes, I think it's super ambitious. And yes, I also think it's realistic.
I definitely see that optimism in your presentation, Sander, which is great. You mentioned carbon emissions. Do you think offsetting them is a simpler solution to meet the climate targets that companies have set themselves?
Well, it's definitely a simpler solution, but it will not get us through to planetary net zero. And I'll explain why. So what we saw a few years ago is that companies had emissions in their supply chain from deforestation, and they would compensate for that by preventing deforestation somewhere else in the world. And of course, if you do that, there's still deforestation going on. And the Paris Climate Agreement is very clear. We need to reach planetary net zero, no emissions anywhere. So that already doesn't work. Then alternatively, we saw that companies move to tree planting instead of purchasing carbon credits from projects that prevent deforestation. And there's another problem with that, which is that trees take roughly 20 years to mature. And only after 20 years, they absorb all this carbon again from the atmosphere. So for 20 years, there's still a net increase in carbon in the atmosphere. And additional to that, in order to compensate for all the emissions in the industry globally, then we would have to replant an area the size of Germany every year again. And obviously, we don't have that amount of space in the world. So no, I don't think offsetting is a solution. And luckily, what we're seeing is also that large brands and traders are moving away from offsetting and work on actually preventing emissions inside their own supply chain. And this is also a requirement nowadays of the Science Based Targets initiative.
Absolutely. We would be remiss perhaps maybe not to mention the coming EUDR regulation and how it will impact on the cocoa sector. My question to you is, do you think the sector is prepared for this regulation?
Well, the sector is preparing, I would say. What you've seen is that the data collection is actually going very well. So the quality and the availability of the farm polygons is really getting there. Of course, companies have 11 months left before the regulation will be into effect. And there's still quite some uncertainty as how the regulation will be enforced. One thing that is, of course, more difficult for the cocoa industry than for the coffee industry is that mass balance is still a quite common approach to the sustainability. So, for example, a company would do a sustainability project somewhere at a cocoa cooperative, which is not necessarily the same place from where they sourced. And now under EUDR, everything will have to become traceable all the way to the individual smaller farms. So it definitely requires a totally different approach to traceability and to sustainability. But also here, I see that companies are already preparing, or that companies already started collecting the data from quite a while ago, even before EUDR became a thing. So yes, I'm confident that most of them will be ready in time as well.
I think the point about preparing is very important because, as your presentation has sort of highlighted today, the way in which that we're using and looking at data to assess, to help us assess the impact of cocoa is changing and growing, and that's fantastic to see. Thank you, Sander, for speaking here with me at Confectionery Live.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.